Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Alice, for the introduction. Thank you, Russell, for inviting me here to speak today. Great to be back in Malta, and even better in front of such a packed audience here at the KPMG eSummit. So, over the next 20 minutes, I'm going to be reflecting on 2018, anticipating 2019. Now, I've been given very strict instructions on timing, and I think we're already running over by about 20 minutes. So I'll leave you to digest what I'm going to talk about up on the screen whilst I give a 1-minute introduction to myself. Hopefully some of you will remember me from my previous incarnation as an equity research analyst covering the gambling sector for the last 13 years. In the summer, along with two of my ex-colleagues, we set up a new venture, Bixteth Partners, which is a name you'll see at the bottom of these slides. So what does Bixteth do? Very simply, we work with management teams to help them realize their ambitions and achieve their company's potential. How do we do that? Well, by engaging at an early stage to understand and maybe shape strategy and introduce external capital at the appropriate time. For any more detail, don't hesitate to look at the website, bixtethpartners.com. Let's go back one. Okay, with that commercial now out the way, let's get on with the show. We live in interesting times, both geopolitically, economically, and in gambling. Looking back on the industry, it's clear to me there's been 3 very distinct phases as the industry has evolved. The first online casino appeared around 1995, followed by 888 Casino on Net in 1997. It was a license to print money, although of course you didn't actually need a license to print the money. EBITDA margins were over 60%, almost treble what they are now, and everything was going great until the interventions of Senator Kyle and Reid, amongst others, who in 2006 tagged the Unlawful Internet Gaming Enforcement Act onto the Safe Port Act one Friday night, and pretty much killed an industry over the weekend. When the London Stock Exchange opened on Monday morning, share prices fell by roughly 2/3. This led to a more restrained period of growth and injected significant caution into the mindset of investors who became increasingly wary of exposure to unregulated markets. Thus, for the next 12 years, we had slower growth as the industry expanded, but outside of North America. However, the online gambling axis shifted again in May as the US Supreme Court repealed PASPA and led first to the opening of the Delaware and New Jersey markets, and subsequently Mississippi, West Virginia, and New Mexico, with Rhode Island and Pennsylvania coming on stream this quarter. And I'll discuss the US in more detail later in this presentation. What is undoubtedly clear, though, is that for the 23 years or so over which the industry has existed, change has been the one constant. And that's been driven by M&A. And if you look at the big 3 quoted players in the market today, namely Paddy Power Betfair, GVC, and the Stars Group, none of them existed in their current form even 3 years ago. So it always serves as a useful reminder to look about the size and scale of the market we are talking about. These figures are taken from the recently revised data from H2 Gambling Capital and relate to their best estimates for 2018. So what does this tell us? This is a huge market, 45 billion euros, up 10% year on year, having expanded at a compound annual growth rate of 10.6% over the past 5 years. But it's not that huge in the context of the overall gambling market, just 12% share. And if we think about mobile within this market, mobile accounts only for 39% of online gambling, meaning that it's only 5% of the total gambling market. And I think it's worth taking a second just to let that sink in. 95% of bets placed in the global gaming industry are not on mobile. That's a huge opportunity. If we look at the geographic breakdown of the market, clearly this is led by Europe for reasons discussed earlier. And the European market's almost double the size of the next biggest market of Asia and the Middle East. Intriguingly, I think 2 of the biggest growth areas in the market currently command just a 1% share each. That's LATAM, which I know you'll hear more on later on, and Africa. And then if we look at the product split, half the market dominated by sports betting. And if you drill down into that data a little bit further, just over half of that sports betting market is horse racing, with the balance made up of other sports. I think over the next 2 to 3 years, you'll see that balance switch round, particularly as gambling on sports picks up in the United States. And casino is clearly a huge market. 27% of the overall share, and the ability to cross-sell from sports into casino effectively and efficiently, I think, remains one of the biggest differentiators of success in this industry. So, reflecting on what's happened over the last 12 months and starting with M&A. It was actually on a KPMG panel at Sigma last year that I was very positive on the prospects for M&A, not least because the outlook from a regulatory perspective was so tough for 2019 that operators would want to position themselves accordingly by doing deals as a defensive mechanism as much as anything else. What would have been harder to predict would have been the Stars Group going all in on sports betting with the acquisition of Sky Betting and Gaming. Nor would it have been possible to predict at that stage Paddy Power Betfair acquiring FanDuel. William Hill's proposed acquisition of Mr. Green has a few dimensions. It diversifies its revenue base whilst increasing the proportion of unregulated revenues, and also provides a Maltese hub for its international online operations, which will appear to be necessary in the post-Brexit world. However, the key takeaway for us is that scale is beginning to win out. Whilst due to the nature of its private equity backing, Sky Betting and Gaming was always going to be an asset that traded, Ladbrokes Coral, William Hill, and Mr. Green all had to do deals as they were subscale. And in the intervening week since submitting these slides, we've seen GVC further strengthen its position in the Australian market with the acquisition of Neds International, whilst intriguingly Evolution has acquired eZugi, its competitor in the US. However, if 2018 is remembered for anything, it will be the year that regulators really started to make an impact on the market. If we look back 13 years ago, operators and analysts talked about the freedom of movement for goods and services in the European Union, emphasizing something called the Gambari ruling, which would allow operators to have one single hub in a European territory and operate across all of them. That became unworkable as member states became protectionist and sought to protect incumbent monopolies. The UK was the most commercial, but lost tax revenues, and arguably the UK Gambling Commission lost control of its market. As such, it now appears to be trying to shut the stable door after the horse has bolted, and we'll look at that in more detail on the next slide. Ireland has also sought to get on the act this year by doubling the rate of online taxation from 1st of January 2019, but due to a public outcry, this is now being reviewed. Our understanding, though, is it will remain in place for 2019, although it could be modified for the 2020 budget. And the widespread implementation of point-of-consumption tax in Australia was ratified by state parliaments earlier this year, and the Italian government set the scene for the introduction of a nationwide advertising ban on online gambling. That's the bad news. I'm sure we could find more of it if we looked hard enough, not least the impending taxation of some of the northern European markets, but there was some good news. Firstly, the Spanish government took the very enlightened step to reduce the tax on gross gaming revenues from 25% to 20% across most online products. And finally, of course, as mentioned earlier, on the 14th of May 2018, the US Supreme Court repealed PASPA. However, turning back to the UK, despite numerous warnings for the industry to get its house in order and for the industry to adopt a collaborative approach to lobbying, we saw the industry manage to talk itself into a worse position than its opponents could possibly have dreamed of 3 years ago. Not only have we seen maximum stakes on B2 gaming machine content, or FOBTs, reduced to £2, the implementation date was the earliest it could have been at April 2019, albeit only after another PR disaster when the UK government was defeated by its own MPs over the date of introduction. To offset the tax loss from B2 content, remote gaming duty will rise to 21% on the same date. This is a shrewd move, higher than the 20% most expected, and with plenty of headroom to the 25% ceiling, where the cost of implementation is likely to reduce competition and drive some customers offshore into unlicensed operators. The fact that the first three organisations on this slide, the DDCMS, HMT, and UKGC, were all involved in the triennial review, highlights what a complicated landscape it has become. The UKGC has been flexing its not inconsiderable muscles, with fines this year for gaming operators now totaling £19 million. And of course, with no formula behind these fines, the potential for them to reach ever-dizzying levels of materiality is clear. All I want from Santa this year is an invite to the UK Gambling Commission Christmas party. And if an operator has successfully negotiated that alphabet soup of organisations, it's fair to assume that the Competition and Markets Authority and the Advertising Standards Association may catch them out. And if that's not enough, the somewhat unfortunate timing for Bet365 to release its annual accounts to coincide with some very dubious interpretation and reporting of child gambling statistics only further serves to highlight the public outcry this industry now faces. So what can be done in the future? Cooperation, collaboration, and benefits to society need to be emphasized, and we'll come on to this in another slide. So, looking forward and anticipating what could happen next year and indeed beyond 2019. Again, using H2 gambling capital statistics, let's look at the forecast growth in this market. So over the next 5 years, the market is forecast to expand at a compound annual growth rate of 7.3%, to reach just over 63 billion euros in 2023. Intriguingly, that will be the first year when mobile is forecast to reach over 50% of the total market at 32.4 billion euros, having grown at a compound annual growth rate of 13.1%. Indeed, 2023 will effectively see no year-on-year growth in desktop for the first time ever. So what are the issues that the industry needs to address to get there? Without wishing to steal the thunder of speakers coming after me, I'm going to try and pick on 3 or 4 key ones. Firstly, responsible gambling. This has to be at the center of everything. I read on Twitter someone challenging the notion of responsible gambling, and how could there be such a thing? Perhaps lessons can be learned from the 2 of the other sin industries, smoking and drinking. Whilst there is very much the acceptability of responsible drinking, there is no such concept of responsible smoking. The challenge for the gambling industry, particularly online, has to be how does the industry make itself more like drinking in the eyes of the regulators and less like smoking? An obvious difference between the 2, to my untrained eyes, is that the drinks and pubs industry put the social aspect of the activity at the front and center of advertising. In an increasingly isolated world, highlighting the benefits that this social connection can bring is key to convincing regulators of the benefit of the activities. Similarly, accept taxation is inevitable, but better lobbying and education of those in power of the detrimental effects of too high a rate of tax should be reinforced. Likewise with advertising. The idea of a 9 p.m. television watershed is nonsensical given how the younger generation consume media at their own time and their own point of choosing. However, it is simply not reasonable to the average person in the street for children to be bombarded with adverts by betting and gaming firms when watching sport. As an aside, Greg Wood wrote an excellent article in the Guardian newspaper in the UK at the weekend, suggesting that maths lessons which incorporated some of the mathematical probabilities behind odds settings and the natural extension of this to return to player theories would be both beneficial from a child harm perspective and insightful from an educational one. These initiatives matter. The other undoubtedly challenging aspect remains Brexit. Even if Theresa May manages to garner enough support in Parliament to pass her Brexit bill, the Spanish government has already seized upon Gibraltar as a political opportunity, and who knows what the state of the border will be like between March 29th, 2019 and December 20th, 2020, and beyond. That, of course, assumes a deal, but after yesterday's performance in the House of Commons, the odds on that must be no better than evens. Brexit also feeds through into the next issue, people. Here in Malta, the unprecedented growth in online gambling firms opening offices places upward pressure on the jobs market and inflates salaries. The same pressure exists in the US, particularly amongst New Jersey-based companies and those in New York, who will now need to compete with Amazon's new second HQ for talent. Over and above this, though, there is the subtler point that for an industry heavily reliant on technology, people can have a disproportionately large impact on a company's success or failure. To paraphrase Kenny Alexander, CEO of GVC, The right people can add value many times over, whilst employing the wrong people can destroy value quickly and severely. It's also worth highlighting that the industry has churned through a significant amount of CEOs and CFOs in recent years, and a period of stability is now needed. Part of that churn has been driven by M&A. We've looked earlier at some of the bigger deals of the past 12 months, and now it's fun to try and stare into our crystal ball and predict who may be next. Undoubtedly, the Nordic-facing operators will have their attractions. Kindred, perhaps most appealingly, but also Betsson, if a workaround for its Turkish-facing business can be established. Likewise, Kambi has developed an attractive portfolio of B2B clients both here in Europe and in the US. Other B2B providers, such as SBTech, may attract interest, while Playtech, almost uniquely now positioned as a B2B and B2C provider of scale, may also be more attractive following Teddy Saggy's recent share sale. There also remains the tantalizing prospect of US acquisitions of European companies. So what can we hope for from the USA? Firstly, things have moved faster than I thought when I spoke in Gibraltar in April at the KPMG Summit there. PASPA had not yet been repealed, and I was skeptical. Fortunately, I was wrong. Rather than run through the complications of the market and repeat various market size and growth estimates, what I've done here is reproduce a slide I presented at G2E in Las Vegas last month. In essence, it's my tips for success. Firstly, embrace regulation. I've spoken at length about it earlier, and the UK's example is of how not to do it. The key thing here in the US will be how quickly the authorities clamp down on the offshore market. Betcris, Bovada, etc. As yet, no sign that is happening. Indeed, from reading US sources yesterday, it appears that Bovada has actively relaunched in New York to citizens. The other thing to do in this market is to avoid federal intervention. While states continue to pass regulation and open up the market, there is still something called the Wire Act that needs to be addressed. And don't forget that Sheldon Adelson, who is Donald Trump's biggest financial backer, is probably the biggest anti-online gambling proponent in the country. Don't forget also that Senator Kyle, who was behind the 2006 UAGA bill, is also back in a position of power following his succession to Senator McCain's role. Secondly, it sounds obvious, but putting the customer at the center of everything is something European operators appear to have forgotten in recent years. Closing winning accounts, factoring bets, imposing, quite frankly, unworkable terms and conditions on sign-up offers, and so forth. As I mentioned a minute ago, people are a key differentiator in this industry and are creating more value than perhaps they should. In the US, they're hard to find, let alone find good ones, so focus on finding the good ones and keeping them. Fourthly, technology. What do I mean by this? What I mean is speed to market is key. This market is growing very fast. Don't spend excessive time and money getting the technology and the front end immaculate. Give people the chance to bet. Give people the chance to bet on what they want, when they want. In-play in New Jersey only currently accounts for 37% of the market, compared to 75% of the market in the UK. In terms of content, this is kind of related to the previous point. Give people reasons to bet, and this is where tie-ups with the leagues in the United States will be important. The United States has data-rich sports with periodic breaks which lends themselves to gambling, but with 30 seconds delay on cable and 45 seconds delay on satellite broadcasts for many sports, getting timely information to the customer will be key. Finally, and I was debating this with Tom from KPMG last night, who will be the winners in this market? Quite frankly, standing up here now, we'd be guessing. But how many winners will there be? Probably of any meaningful scale and profitability, low to mid-single digits. Yet at the last count, there were 27 operators that had expressed serious interest in investing in the United States. Hundreds of millions of dollars will be lost in this market. So what else should we be looking out for as areas of growth? It's always handy when one of your slides chimes with what's been said by the Minister, so we'll start with esports. Esports is getting bigger and more commercial all the time. The $1.5 billion market that was alluded to earlier continues to evolve. The revenue model isn't yet fixed, but there's no reason gambling companies shouldn't sponsor teams or players, let alone offer odds on some of the bigger events. Virtual reality, I think, could be key in this market. Technology continues to improve. Why shouldn't VR be used to improve the experience, both online and on-premise? Softer gambling will become more important. Give customers product that more customers want to use. Fortnite has more than 200 million registered users. There have to be other ways to attract a broader market, whether that be fantasy games, skill-based games, or subscription-based models. Africa. Africa is a massive market and mostly regulated, with mobile money at the heart of the payments ecosystem. With a high proportion of lottery-style accumulator bets, margins are great. Africa will become, I think, one of the biggest growth markets over the next 2 to 3 years. And finally, India. Different interpretations of the Law Commission's pronouncement that online gambling could become legalized have led to different operators taking a different approach. But undoubtedly, what is clear, this is a huge market. 250, 300 million predominantly English-speaking middle-class customers with a high affinity for sports and a high propensity to gamble. You'll notice that blockchain is missing from this list. Not that I don't believe in it. I certainly think that in 15 to 20 years' time, the vast majority of online gambling transactions will take place using some form of blockchain technology. But it is impossible to predict the rate and depth of adoption by consumers and operators alike. So I think I've just about kept to time, and hopefully at least some of what I've said has been of interest. To finish, I'd just like to recap with 5 quick key points. Firstly, this industry is unrecognizable from 3 years ago. Who knows what it will look like in 3 years' time? Secondly, growth is driven by regulation and technological development. Regulation can't keep up with technology, but without either of those two, gaming is just a GDP growth type industry. But the opportunity is huge. I go back to the point that only 5% of every wager in gambling worldwide is made using a mobile device. The industry now has no choice other than to embrace regulation. The industry needs to show it can add value to society. There's plenty of exciting growth opportunities out there, and they don't all revolve around the United States. I've mentioned Africa and India, and there's a session later on here on LATAM. And finally, to make gambling more acceptable, the industry has to innovate to create broader appeal. Think esports, virtual reality, skill-based games. The market can't exist in its current narrow funnel, but the opportunity there is huge. Thanks very much for listening, and enjoy the rest of your day.